The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the cramped archive room of Cascade National Forest headquarters as Sarah Mitchell squinted at her computer screen. October rain drummed against the windows, creating rivulets that distorted her view of the towering Douglas firs outside. She'd been digitizing old park photographs for 3 hours, her eyes burning from staring at decades of faded images. Sarah pushed a strand of auburn hair behind her ear and reached for her coffee mug, finding it empty and cold. As a park ranger with 15 years of experience in Oregon's wilderness, she'd seen her share of strange things. But lately, the administrative work felt more draining than any backcountry rescue mission. The next photograph in the stack made her pause. It was a recent digital print from 2010, submitted by a visitor named David Chen, who'd been hiking Eagles Ridge that September. The image showed a lone elderly man walking along the narrow mountain path, his back to the camera. He wore a worn brown jacket and carried a gnarled walking stick, his white hair visible beneath a weathered cap. Something about the figure struck Sarah as oddly familiar, though she couldn't place why. She made a note in the digital catalogue and moved to file the photo when her hand brushed against an old manila folder marked Historical Archives, 1920s. Curiosity got the better of her. Sarah opened the folder and began flipping through black and white photographs from the park's early days. Visitors in formal hiking attire, park officials in crisp uniforms, and scenic shots of trails that hadn't changed much in 80 years. Then she stopped breathing. The photograph was labeled Eagles Ridge Trail, September 15th, 1925, unknown visitor. It showed the exact same mountain path, the same rocky outcropping, even the same twisted pine tree in the background. But what made Sarah's blood run cold was the figure in the center of the frame, an elderly man in a brown jacket, carrying a walking stick, his white hair visible beneath a cap. The same weathered face, the same stooped posture, the same everything. It was impossible, but there he was, identical in every detail to the man in David Chen's 2010 photograph. Sarah's hands trembled as she held both images side by side. The 1925 photo was authentic. She could tell from the paper stock, the photographic techniques, even the handwritten notation on the back in faded ink. But the 2010 digital image was equally genuine, complete with metadata showing the exact date and GPS coordinates. She grabbed a magnifying glass from her desk drawer and examined both photographs more closely. Every wrinkle on the man's face, every fold in his clothing, the angle of his walking stick, everything matched perfectly. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was the same person, captured 85 years apart, apparently unchanged by time. "That's not possible," Sarah whispered to the empty room. She turned to her computer and pulled up the park's incident database, searching for any reports related to Eagles Ridge. What she found made her stomach clench with unease. Over the past 90 years, 17 hikers had gone missing on that particular trail. The disappearances occurred sporadically, sometimes years apart, sometimes in clusters. All were solo hikers, all were last seen heading toward the ridge's summit. The most recent disappearance was in 2011, just 1 year after David Chen had taken his photograph. A retired teacher named Margaret Fuller had set out for a day hike and never returned. Search teams had found no trace of her, except for a single hiking boot, discovered near the same rocky outcropping, visible in both photographs. Sarah printed both images and spread them across her desk, along with the missing persons files. The rain outside intensified, and somewhere in the building, a door slammed shut. She was alone in the archive room, but suddenly she didn't feel alone at all. A chill ran down her spine as she realized something else. Tomorrow was September 15th, exactly 85 years after the first photograph was taken. And according to the weather forecast, a major storm system was moving in from the Pacific, bringing the kind of fog and rain that could trap hikers on exposed ridges for days. Sarah reached for her phone to call her supervisor, then hesitated. What would she say? That she'd found proof of time travel in the filing cabinet, that some immortal figure was wandering the mountains, possibly connected to nearly 2 decades of disappearances. Instead, she made a different decision. She grabbed her rain jacket from the back of her chair and headed for the door. Eagles Ridge was only an hour's drive from headquarters, and she had just enough daylight left to reach the trailhead. Whatever was happening on that mountain, she intended to find answers. As Sarah walked through the empty corridors of the building, she didn't notice the elderly man standing in the shadows outside, watching her through the rain-streaked windows. He leaned heavily on a gnarled walking stick, his weathered face unchanged by the passing decades, waiting patiently, as he had learned to do so very long ago. Sarah's Park Service truck bounced along the gravel access road as evening shadows stretched between the towering evergreens. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the intensifying rain, and visibility dropped to mere yards ahead. She should have waited until morning, but something about those photographs had ignited an urgency she couldn't ignore. The Eagles Ridge trailhead sat at the end of a narrow dirt road, marked only by a weathered wooden sign and a small parking area carved from the forest. Sarah pulled up next to the trail marker and cut the engine, immediately hearing the sound of rain hammering on the truck's roof. Through the passenger window, she could make out the beginning of the hiking trail disappearing into the misty darkness ahead. She checked her gear one more time: flashlight, radio, first aid kit, emergency beacon, and her service pistol. Standard equipment for any backcountry investigation, though she doubted a gun would help against whatever she might encounter on the ridge. The photographs were sealed in a waterproof pouch, along with copies of the missing persons files. As Sarah stepped out of the truck, the cold mountain air hit her like a physical blow. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since she'd left headquarters, and her breath formed white clouds in the beam of her flashlight. The trail ahead was muddy and treacherous, with exposed roots and loose rocks made slippery by the constant rain. She began her ascent, following the familiar path she'd hiked dozens of times during routine patrols. But tonight felt different. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, except for the steady drumming of rain on leaves and the occasional crack of a branch in the wind. Even the usual night sounds, owls, coyotes, the rustle of small animals, were absent. After 30 minutes of steady climbing, Sarah reached the first switchback and paused to catch her breath. Her radio crackled with static, and she tried to raise headquarters, but got only white noise in response. The mountains often interfered with communications, but she was still relatively low on the trail. She made a mental note to try again at higher elevation. The beam of her flashlight swept across the forest floor, illuminating patches of moss and fallen logs. Everything looked normal, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Twice she spun around, certain she'd heard footsteps behind her, but found only empty trail and swaying trees. As she continued climbing, Sarah began to notice something odd about the forest around her. The trees seemed older somehow, more gnarled and twisted than she remembered. Moss hung from branches in thick curtains, and the underbrush was denser, as if the forest had aged decades in the space of her hour-long drive. At the second switchback, she found the first marker, a small metal plate embedded in a boulder that read, Eagles Ridge Trail, Estasha 1923, elevation 4,200 feet. Sarah had passed this marker countless times before, but tonight she stopped to examine it more closely. The metal looked newer than it should, as if it had been recently installed, yet the date clearly showed it was nearly a century old. She pulled out the photographs to compare the surroundings with the images. Even in the darkness and rain, she could identify several landmarks: the distinctive shape of a lightning-struck snag, the cluster of boulders near the trail junction, the peculiar way the path curved around a massive Douglas fir. Everything matched both photographs perfectly. Sarah pressed on, her unease growing with each step. The higher she climbed, the thicker the fog became, until her flashlight beam could penetrate only a few feet ahead. The world beyond that narrow cone of light had ceased to exist, leaving her isolated in a bubble of rain and shadow. At 5,000 feet elevation, she reached the spot where the trail branched off toward the ridge proper. This was where most of the missing hikers had last been seen, according to the witness statements in their files. Sarah stood at the junction, rain dripping from the brim of her hat, and tried her radio again. Nothing but static filled with strange whispers that might have been atmospheric interference or something else entirely. She was truly alone now, cut off from the outside world by weather and elevation. That's when she saw it, a faint light moving through the trees ahead, following the ridge trail. At first she thought it might be another hiker's flashlight, but the glow was steady and yellow, like firelight or an old-fashioned lantern. It moved with purpose, neither hurried nor hesitant, maintaining a constant distance from her position. Sarah called out, "Hello? Park Ranger, are you okay out there?" The light stopped moving. For a long moment, it remained stationary among the trees, and Sarah held her breath, straining to hear any response over the sound of rain. Then, slowly, the light began moving again, not away from her as she expected, but directly toward her position. As it approached, Sarah could make out more details. It was indeed a lantern held by a tall figure in dark clothing, but something was wrong with the way the person moved, too smooth and gliding, as if their feet never quite touched the ground. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her radio, then to her weapon. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to get back to her truck and call for backup. But she was a park ranger, and if someone was in trouble on the mountain, it was her job to help. The figure with the lantern stopped about 20 yards away, close enough that Sarah should have been able to see their face in the flickering light. Instead, shadows seemed to gather around the person's features, obscuring any details except for the pale gleam of white hair beneath a cap. "Sir, are you all right?" Sarah called, her voice steadier than she felt. "This isn't safe weather for hiking." The figure raised the lantern higher, and in its glow Sarah caught a glimpse of weathered clothing and gnarled fingers gripping a walking stick. Her blood turned to ice as recognition hit her. It was him, the man from both photographs, standing there as real as the rain soaking through her jacket. And when he spoke, his voice carried across the space between them, with impossible clarity, cutting through the storm as if the weather didn't exist at all. "Been waiting for you, Sarah Mitchell. Been waiting a long, long time." Sarah's hand froze on her radio as the elderly man's words echoed through the rain-soaked forest. The impossible was happening. The figure from both photographs stood before her, apparently unchanged by the 85 years between those images. Her rational mind screamed that this had to be some kind of elaborate hoax, but every instinct honed by years in the wilderness told her she was facing something far beyond normal explanation. "How do you know my name?" Sarah managed, her voice barely audible over the storm. She kept her flashlight trained on the figure, though the beam seemed to weaken in his presence, as if the darkness around him absorbed the light. The elderly man stepped closer, and Sarah could see more details in the lantern's flickering glow. His face was deeply lined with age, skin like weathered leather stretched over sharp cheekbones, but his eyes were what made her stomach clench with terror. They were ancient, holding depths of time that no human should possess, and they reflected the lantern light like an animal's eyes in the dark. "I know everyone who comes to the ridge," he said, his voice carrying that same unnatural clarity. "Just like I knew Margaret Fuller in 2011, and Thomas Brennan in 2003, and Catherine Hayes in 1997. I've been walking these trails since before you were born, Sarah Mitchell, since before your parents were born." Sarah's hand moved to her weapon, though she doubted bullets would be effective against whatever this creature was. "The missing hikers. You know what happened to them." The man smiled, revealing teeth that were too white, too sharp. "Know what happened? Child, I am what happened to them, just like I'm what's going to happen to you, unless you're smarter than the others. Most aren't. They see an old man in need of help, and their good hearts doom them." A crash of thunder rolled across the mountains, and in the brief illumination of lightning, Sarah saw something that made her blood freeze. Behind the elderly man, barely visible in the storm, stood other figures, hikers in clothing from different eras. A woman in 1990s gear, a man in clothing that looked decades older, others wearing styles she couldn't immediately place. All of them had the same hollow, ancient eyes as the man with the lantern. "What are you?" Sarah whispered, though part of her already knew the answer would be something her rational mind couldn't accept. "I am the walker," he replied, leaning heavily on his gnarled stick. "Been walking these mountains since 1873, when I made the mistake of getting lost in a blizzard and calling out to anything that would listen. Something listened, Sarah. Something old and hungry that lives in the deep places of the earth. It saved me from freezing to death, but the price was higher than I understood." The lantern flame danced wildly in the wind, casting writhing shadows across his weathered features. "I cannot die, cannot age, cannot rest, but I can share the gift, add others to my eternal journey. Every few years, when the hunger becomes too much to bear, I walk the ridge trail and wait for someone kind enough to stop and help a lost old man." Sarah backed away, her boots slipping on the muddy trail. "The photographs. How is that possible?" "Time moves differently for us," the walker explained, gesturing to the figures behind him. "We exist in all moments simultaneously, past, present, and future, bleeding together like watercolors in the rain. Your Mr. Chen simply captured one moment where the barrier was thin enough to see through." Another lightning flash revealed more figures emerging from the forest. Men and women from different decades, all with that same hollow stare, all carrying the weight of years far beyond their apparent age. Sarah realized with growing horror that she was looking at every hiker who had disappeared on Eagle's Ridge, transformed into something between life and death, cursed to walk the mountain trails for eternity. "The tribal warnings," Sarah said, pieces falling into place. "The Warm Springs and Wasco peoples, they know about you." The walker nodded approvingly. Smart girl. Yes, they know. Their ancestors warned them to stay away from certain places when the barriers grow thin. They call me he who walks between times, though they have other names too, less flattering ones. Sarah's radio crackled with static, and through the white noise she could swear she heard voices calling her name. Not her colleagues at headquarters, but something else. The voices of the disappeared, perhaps, trying to warn her. You have a choice, the walker continued, his ancient eyes fixed on hers. Join us willingly and retain some portion of yourself. Fight, and become nothing more than a hollow echo like poor Margaret there. He gestured to one of the figures, and Sarah recognized the face from the missing person file. Margaret Fuller, the retired teacher, who had vanished in 2011. Margaret's mouth moved as if trying to speak, but only a rasping whisper emerged. Run. The walker's expression hardened. Margaret always was troublesome, but you're different, Sarah Mitchell. You sought me out instead of stumbling into my path. That shows wisdom or perhaps foolishness. Either way, it intrigues me. Sarah's mind raced, searching for options. She was outnumbered, cut off from communication, and facing something that defied every natural law she understood. But she was also a park ranger, trained to think clearly under pressure and to protect others from danger. If I agree to join you, she said carefully, what happens to the others? The people who might hike this trail in the future? The walker tilted his head, considering. The hunt continues. It must. We are sustained by the living, Sarah. Without fresh souls to add to our number, we fade into true death. But with your help, we could be more selective. Take only those who won't be missed, those who are already lost in their own ways. Sarah felt sick at the suggestion, but she nodded as if considering it. Show me, she said. Show me what you really are. The walker smiled that terrible sharp smile and set his lantern on the ground. As he straightened, his form began to change. His weathered clothing remained the same, but his body stretched upward, growing taller and more skeletal. His face elongated, the skin pulling tight over protruding bones, and his eyes sank deeper into their sockets until they became pools of shadow. The other figures around him underwent similar transformations, revealing the true horror of what they had become, not human anymore, but something twisted and hungry, held together by unnatural forces and driven by an endless need to feed on the living. This is what awaits you, the walker said in a voice like wind through dead leaves. But also power, knowledge, freedom from the constraints of mortal time. You could help me for decades, centuries. Think of all you could see, all you could learn. Sarah looked at the transformed figures surrounding her, at poor Margaret Fuller's anguished face, at the walker's inhuman form. Then she made her choice. I'll show you what I think of your offer, she said, and grabbed a flare from her emergency kit. Sarah's flare ignited with a brilliant red hiss, casting hellish light across the transformed faces of the walker and his victims. The creatures recoiled from the sudden brightness, their hollow eyes reflecting the flame like mirrors. In that moment of confusion, Sarah did the only thing her training and instincts told her to do. She ran. She sprinted down the muddy trail, her boots slipping and sliding on the treacherous surface. Behind her she could hear the walker's voice rising above the storm, no longer human but something ancient and furious. The sound made her teeth ache and her vision blur, but she forced herself to keep moving. The flare in her hand provided the only reliable light, as her flashlight had mysteriously dimmed to almost nothing. Tree branches whipped at her face and caught at her jacket, while exposed roots tried to trip her with every step. The trail that had seemed familiar during her ascent now felt alien and hostile, as if the mountain itself had turned against her. A sound like rushing wind filled the air behind her, and Sarah risked a glance back. The creatures were following, but not running. They flowed through the forest like smoke, moving between the trees without regard for the physical obstacles that slowed her down. The walker led them, his skeletal form gliding over the ground with impossible speed. You cannot escape us, Sarah Mitchell. His voice echoed from everywhere at once. These mountains are our domain. We know every path, every shadow, every hiding place. Sarah's lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, trying to remember the layout of the trail system. If she could reach the lower junction where the path split toward Cascade Creek, she might be able to lose them in the maze of smaller trails. But that was still half a mile away, and her supernatural pursuers were gaining ground. The flare began to sputter, its brilliant light fading to a weak red glow. Sarah pulled out her emergency flashlight, praying it would work better than her primary light had. To her relief, it produced a strong white beam. Apparently, whatever force had drained her other equipment didn't affect all technology equally. As she rounded a sharp curve in the trail, Sarah nearly collided with a large Douglas fir that had fallen across the path. Recent storm damage, she realized, forcing her to scramble over the massive trunk. Her pursuers flowed around the obstacle like water, never slowing. But the fallen tree gave Sarah an idea. She pulled out her emergency radio and switched it to the emergency broadcast frequency. Even if headquarters couldn't hear her clearly, the signal would be logged, creating a record of her location and situation. She pressed the transmit button and spoke rapidly. "Park Service Dispatch, this is Ranger Mitchell, badge number 4471. I'm on Eagles Ridge Trail, approximately 2 miles above the main trailhead. I've encountered the source of the missing hiker incidents. Repeat, the walker is real. Do not send rescue teams to this location without full supernatural protocols. The missing persons are still alive but transformed. I'm attempting to reach Cascade Creek Junction. If you don't hear from me by dawn, seal off this entire area." The radio crackled with static, but she thought she heard a faint acknowledgement through the white noise. Then the device went dead completely, its screen flickering once before going black. Sarah stuffed the useless radio back in her pack and focused on running. The trail ahead dropped steeply through a series of switchbacks, and she took them at dangerous speed, using trees and boulders to control her descent. Behind her, the unnatural wind sound grew louder, accompanied by whispers in languages she didn't recognize. At the 4th switchback, she stumbled and went down hard, her knee striking a sharp rock. Pain shot through her leg, but she forced herself back to her feet. Blood soaked through her pants, but she could still run, and that was all that mattered. The dying flare cast weird shadows as she limped down the trail. In those shifting red patterns, Sarah began to see things that shouldn't exist. Faces in the bark of trees, reaching hands formed by twisted branches, eyes gleaming from hollow logs. The boundary between reality and nightmare was breaking down, and she wondered if this was how the other victims had felt in their final moments of humanity. "Sarah," the voice came from directly ahead of her, soft and concerned. "Sarah, are you hurt?" She looked up to see Margaret Fuller standing in the middle of the trail, no longer transformed, but appearing exactly as she had in her missing person photo. The retired teacher wore her hiking clothes and carried a day pack, her grey hair neatly pulled back under a baseball cap. "Margaret?" Sarah slowed, uncertain. "How are you here? I saw what you became." "It's not real," Margaret said, stepping closer. "The transformation, the walker, all of it. You're hypothermic, Sarah. You've been wandering in circles for hours. I'm part of the search team. We've been looking for you since your truck was found at the trailhead." Sarah wanted desperately to believe it. The rational explanation felt like a lifeline in the ocean of supernatural horror she'd been drowning in. But something was wrong with Margaret's eyes. They reflected the flare light just like the other creatures, and when she smiled, her teeth were too sharp. "You're not Margaret," Sarah whispered, backing away. "She's been missing for 2 years." The thing wearing Margaret's face laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Smart girl. But you're tired, aren't you? So very tired of running. Why don't you rest? Just for a moment." The false Margaret began to change, her kind features melting like wax to reveal the hollow-eyed creature beneath. But Sarah was already moving, diving off the trail into the dense underbrush that bordered the path. Branches tore at her clothes and skin as she crashed through the forest, abandoning any attempt at stealth for pure speed. She could hear them behind her, no longer bothering with deception. The walker's voice rose above the storm, speaking words in that ancient language that made the air itself seem to writhe and twist. Sarah felt something brush against her mind, trying to worm its way into her thoughts, and she fought it off with memories of her training, her purpose, her duty to protect others from exactly this kind of danger. The flare finally died completely, leaving her with only the emergency flashlight. But ahead, through the trees, she could see something that filled her with hope. The warm glow of electric lights from the ranger station at Cascade Creek. She'd made it further than she thought, and if she could reach that building, she might have a chance. Sarah burst from the tree line and stumbled across the small parking area toward the station. The building was dark except for the security lights, but it represented safety, civilization, and most importantly, a radio that might actually work. She reached the front door and fumbled for her master key, her hands shaking so badly she could barely insert it into the lock. Behind her, the wind sound grew deafeningly loud and she could feel the presence of the creatures at the edge of the clearing. The door opened just as something cold and skeletal brushed against the back of her neck. Sarah slammed the door behind her and immediately threw the deadbolt, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Cascade Creek Ranger Station was small but solid. built from thick timber and stone to withstand mountain weather. She pressed her back against the door and listened, hearing only the sound of rain on the roof and her own ragged breathing. The building's interior was dark, except for the green glow of emergency exit signs and the red blinking light of the radio equipment. Sarah fumbled along the wall until she found the light switch, flooding the main room with harsh fluorescent illumination. The familiar sight of Park Service furniture and equipment helped ground her in reality after the nightmare on the trail. She limped to the radio console, her injured knee throbbing with each step. Blood had soaked through her pants and into her boot, leaving dark spots on the wooden floor. But the pain kept her focused, reminded her that she was still human and still alive. The radio powered up with a reassuring electronic hum. Sarah grabbed the microphone and switched to the emergency frequency, praying that the station's more powerful transmitter could punch through whatever interference had plagued her portable equipment. Park Service Dispatch. This is Ranger Mitchell at Cascade Creek Station. Priority emergency. Do you copy? Static filled the speakers for several long seconds. Then a familiar voice crackled through the white noise. Sarah, this is Tom at Dispatch. We've been trying to reach you for hours. Your truck was found at Eagles Ridge trailhead, but there was no sign of you. Relief flooded through Sarah's body, making her legs weak. Contact with the outside world meant she wasn't completely trapped in whatever supernatural pocket the walker controlled. Tom, listen carefully. I need you to contact the tribal police immediately. Ask them about the walker. About he who walks between times, they'll understand. Sarah, you're breaking up. Did you say tribal police? What's your situation out there? Before Sarah could respond, the lights went out. The radio continued humming on battery power, but the building was plunged into darkness. Outside she could hear movement, not the random sounds of wildlife, but purposeful footsteps circling the station. Sarah? Sarah? Are you there? Tom's voice took on an urgent tone. She keyed the microphone, whispering now. Tom, I'm here. The building just lost power. I've discovered what happened to the missing hikers. They're not dead. They've been transformed into something else. The disappearances on Eagles Ridge are connected to an entity that's been hunting people since the 1800s. Jesus, Sarah, you sound hypothermic. Are you injured? I'm sending a rescue team to your location. No, Sarah's whisper became fierce. Do not send anyone up here tonight. That's how it feeds, on people trying to help others. Promise me, Tom. No rescue teams until daylight, and only then with tribal consultation. The radio went silent except for static. Sarah wasn't sure if her message had gotten through clearly, but she'd done what she could. Now she had to focus on surviving until dawn. She pulled out her emergency flashlight and swept the beam around the station's interior. The building had been designed as a way station for rangers on extended backcountry patrols, so it contained basic supplies, a first aid kit, emergency food, sleeping bags, and most importantly, a gun safe containing a shotgun and ammunition. Sarah retrieved the weapon and loaded it with buckshot, knowing it probably wouldn't kill the walker, but hoping it might slow him down. Then she settled into the corner farthest from the windows, where she could watch both the front door and the back exit. Minutes passed in tense silence. The rain continued drumming on the roof, but the sounds of movement outside had stopped. Sarah began to hope that whatever force prevented the creatures from immediately breaking down the door might hold until sunrise. Then she heard the walker's voice, muffled by the walls, but still carrying that unnatural clarity. Sarah Mitchell, you found yourself a fine shelter, but it won't hold us forever. This building sits on old ground that was sacred to the first peoples long before your Park Service existed. The barriers are thin here, especially during storms like this. Sarah didn't respond, but she noticed that the temperature in the building was dropping rapidly. Her breath began forming white clouds in the beam of her flashlight, and frost started forming on the windows despite the rain outside. I've been thinking about your offer to be selective, the walker continued, to take only those who wouldn't be missed. It shows wisdom, an understanding of the necessary evils. But I'm afraid that ship has sailed, as you modern people say. You've seen too much, know too much, and more importantly, you've contacted the outside world. The front windows began to glow with pale, sickly light. Sarah could see shapes moving outside, more than the handful of transformed victims she'd encountered on the trail. Whatever power the walker commanded seemed to be growing stronger as the night deepened. However, the walker's voice took on a persuasive tone. I'm prepared to offer you one final choice. Open the door, come out willingly, and I'll ensure your transformation preserves more of your original personality. You could retain your memories, your sense of purpose. Think of it. Eternal existence with the knowledge and perspective you've gained as a ranger. You could help protect these mountains in ways no mortal ever could. Sarah gripped the shotgun tighter. The offer was tempting in a sick way, especially as exhaustion and blood loss made her feel lightheaded. But she thought about the hollow-eyed figures she'd seen, about Margaret Fuller's desperate whisper to run, about all the families who'd never learned what happened to their missing loved ones. Or, the walker continued, remain stubborn, and when we break through, and we will break through, you'll become nothing more than a puppet, an empty shell that serves our needs without question or complaint. The choice is yours, Sarah Mitchell, but choose quickly. My patience grows thin, and my hunger grows strong. The pale light outside intensified, and Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze, the sound of claws scraping against the station's log walls. Long, slow scratches that seemed to be testing the building's defenses, looking for weak points. She activated her radio again, keeping her voice low. Tom, if you can hear me, I need you to contact Dr. Elizabeth Crow Feather with the Tribal Cultural Department. Tell her the walker is active on Eagles Ridge, and he's trapped a park ranger at Cascade Creek Station. She'll know what that means. The scratching sounds grew louder, and Sarah realized they were coming from multiple directions now. The creatures were surrounding the building, systematically searching for a way inside. The temperature continued dropping, and her flashlight beam revealed that ice crystals were forming on the interior walls. Doctor, Crow Feather, Sarah repeated into the radio. Tell her the barrier is weakening and we need the old protections. Tell her someone needs to remember the songs her grandmother taught her. The radio crackled once more, then went completely dead. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Whatever was about to happen, she was now completely cut off from the outside world. In that profound quiet, Sarah heard something new, a sound like singing, but in no language she recognized. The voices were many, layered over each other in harmonies that seemed to come from the earth itself. And slowly, impossibly, the temperature began to rise. The singing grew stronger, and Sarah felt something fundamental shift in the air around her. The frost on the windows began to melt, and the pale, sickly light outside dimmed, as if being pushed back by an invisible force. The voices weaving through the night were definitely human, but they carried a power that seemed to resonate in her bones. Outside, the walker's confident tone changed to something closer to alarm. No, his voice carried through the walls. They cannot interfere. The old treaties were broken long ago. This is my domain now. But the singing continued, and Sarah realized she could distinguish individual voices within the chorus. Men and women, young and old, all joined in what sounded like a protective chant. She'd heard similar songs during cultural demonstrations at Park Service events, but never with this intensity, this sense of purpose that seemed to bend reality around its rhythm. A new voice spoke from directly outside the station's front door, elderly, female, and completely unafraid of the creatures surrounding the building. Jacob Whitmore. The name was spoken with quiet authority. That was your name when you were human, before you made your bargain with the hunger that sleeps beneath the mountains. Sarah heard the walker's sharp intake of breath, a sound like wind through broken glass. You have no power over me, old woman. I am beyond such things now. Are you? The elderly voice held a note of amusement. Then why do you flinch when I speak your true name? Why do your creatures retreat from our songs? The earth remembers, Jacob. It remembers what you were before you chose to become what you are. Through the front window, Sarah could see figures moving in the darkness. Not the walker's transformed victims, but living people carrying what looked like burning sage and cedar. Their singing created a protective circle around the ranger station, and wherever they walked, the pale light of the creatures dimmed and faded. You cannot banish me, the walker snarled, but his voice seemed more distant now, as if he was being forced back against his will. I have fed for over a century. I have power you cannot comprehend. Power stolen from the innocent, the elderly woman replied. Power that was never yours to take, and power that can be returned to its rightful place. Sarah pressed her face to the window, trying to see more clearly. In the flickering light of the ceremonial fires, she could make out perhaps a dozen people, all Native American, all moving with purpose and confidence through what should have been a supernatural battleground. At their center was an elderly woman with long gray braids, wearing traditional clothing and carrying a staff decorated with feathers and carved symbols. Dr. Crow Feather, Sarah whispered, recognizing the tribal cultural director from Park Service meetings. Somehow her desperate radio message had gotten through, and help had arrived in a form she could never have expected. The doctor's voice rose above the others as she began speaking directly to the walker. Jacob Whitmore, trapper and prospector, lost in the blizzard of 1873. You called to the hunger in your desperation, begged it to save your life at any price, but even the hunger cannot claim a soul without consent, and you gave yours freely. I was dying. The walker's voice was defensive now, almost plaintive. I was alone and freezing and dying in the snow. It offered life. It offered existence, Dr. Crowfeather corrected. Life is what you took from others to sustain that existence. Life stolen from Margaret Fuller, from Thomas Brennan, from Catherine Hayes, from all the others who showed you kindness and received damnation in return. Sarah heard movement on the roof, something large and heavy settling onto the building above her head. Through the ceiling, the walker's voice came clearer and more desperate. They chose to help me. Their compassion doomed them, not my actions. I merely accepted what was offered. Lies you tell yourself to justify the horror you've become, the doctor replied. But the earth knows truth from falsehood, Jacob, and tonight the earth speaks through us. The singing intensified, and Sarah felt the building shake as if something massive was trying to break free from deep underground. The sensation wasn't terrifying like the walker's presence. Instead, it felt like the mountain itself was awakening, stirring to defend its children. You want to know the real tragedy, Dr. Crowfeather continued, her voice carrying easily through the storm. In 1873, when you were lost in that blizzard, you were only 2 miles from a winter camp. My great-great-grandmother was there. If you had continued walking instead of giving up and calling to the hunger, she would have saved you as a human being, not as the twisted thing you became. The weight on the roof shifted, and Sarah heard what might have been sobbing, if creatures like the walker were capable of such human emotions. 2 miles, the doctor repeated, 2 miles to warmth and safety, and a life lived naturally until its proper end. Instead, you chose the easy path, the dark path, and condemned yourself to an eternity of feeding on others' generosity. I didn't know. The walker's voice was barely a whisper now. How could I have known? You couldn't, Dr. Crowfeather agreed, and her tone softened slightly. But you could have chosen differently when the first innocent person tried to help you. You could have chosen differently with each subsequent victim. You could have chosen differently tonight when Sarah Mitchell showed you the same kindness that has been your bait for over a century. Sarah gripped the shotgun tighter as she listened to this supernatural confrontation. Part of her wanted to feel sorry for the walker, Jacob Whitmore, who had been lost and desperate when he made his fatal bargain. But then she thought of the hollow-eyed victims she'd seen, of the decades of families left wondering what happened to their loved ones. What happens now? The walker asked. And for the first time since Sarah had encountered him, he sounded truly afraid. Now you choose again, Dr. Crowfeather replied. Release those you've taken. Let them find the peace that has been denied them. End the cycle of predation and hunger. And if I refuse? The singing grew louder, more complex, and Sarah felt the building shake again. This time she could see through the windows, as the very ground around the station began to glow with soft, warm light, not the sickly pale radiance of the creatures, but something clean and alive. Then we sing you down into the deep places where the hunger dwells, the doctor said simply. We send you back to the darkness you chose, and we seal the way behind you so thoroughly that even your memory will fade from this world. Sarah heard the walker moving on the roof, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. The transformed victims stood at the edge of the protective circle, visible in the growing light from the earth, all of them staring at their captor with expressions of desperate hope. They're mine, the walker said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. I made them what they are. They belong to me. No one belongs to anyone, Dr. Crowfeather replied firmly. That was your first mistake, and it's been your greatest sin. Choose, Jacob Whitmore. Choose now, before the earth decides for you. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain and the soft, continuous singing of the assembled tribal members. Sarah held her breath, waiting to see whether the man who had become the walker would finally find the courage to choose correctly after more than a century of choosing wrong. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of more than a century's worth of accumulated guilt and horror. Sarah could feel the tension building like pressure before a thunderstorm, the very air seeming to hold its breath, while Jacob Whitmore, the walker, wrestled with a decision that would determine the fate of every soul he had claimed. From her position inside the ranger station, Sarah watched through the window as the transformed victims stood motionless at the edge of Dr. Crowfeather's protective circle. Their hollow eyes were fixed on the roof where their captor paced, and for the first time since her ordeal began, Sarah thought she could see something like hope flickering in those ancient, tormented faces. Margaret Fuller raised one trembling hand, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the night, despite its whispered tone. "Jacob, please. We've been walking for so long. We're so tired." Other voices joined hers. Decades of missing hikers finding their voices for perhaps the first time since their transformation. Thomas Brennan from 2003, Catherine Hayes from 1997, others whose names Sarah didn't know, but whose faces told stories of lives cut short and families left behind. "Let us rest," pleaded a man in clothing that looked like it belonged to the 1980s. "Let us go home." The weight on the roof shifted again, and Sarah heard something that chilled her to the bone. The walker was laughing, but it was the broken laughter of someone whose sanity had been stretched beyond all limits. "Home." His voice cracked with bitter amusement. "You think there's a home waiting for you after what you've become? After what I've made you do? The things we've done together in the deep woods? The people we've hunted? The lives we've taken to feed the hunger? You think you can just walk away from that?" Dr. Crowfeather's voice cut through his hysteria like a blade. "The corruption was forced upon them, Jacob. They had no choice in what they became, no voice in the acts they were compelled to commit. Their spirits remained clean, even if their forms were twisted by your master's influence." "My master?" The walker's laugh became sharper, more desperate. "You think I serve the hunger? You think I chose to become its puppet? I am as much a victim as any of them." "You were a victim," the doctor agreed. "In 1873, lost in a blizzard, you were absolutely a victim. But every choice you made afterward, every innocent person you lured to share your fate, every family you destroyed by stealing their loved ones, those were your choices, Jacob. Yours alone." Sarah pressed closer to the window, watching as the confrontation reached its climax. The singing had grown more complex, harmonies weaving together in patterns that seemed to resonate with the earth itself. The glow from the ground was spreading, creating a network of light that encompassed the entire clearing around the ranger station. "Even now," Dr. Crowfeather continued, "you have a choice. Release them. Let them find peace. Accept responsibility for what you've done, and face whatever judgment awaits." "And if I do?" The walker's voice was smaller now, almost childlike. "What happens to me? Do I just disappear? Do I face some cosmic punishment for my crimes?" "I don't know," the doctor admitted, "but I do know that continuing on this path will only lead to more suffering. For them, for you, and for everyone else you'll encounter in the years to come. The hunger grows stronger with each feeding, Jacob. How many more innocent lives will you sacrifice to delay your own reckoning?" Sarah heard footsteps moving across the roof, slow and deliberate. When the walker spoke again, his voice seemed to come from directly above her position. "Sarah Mitchell," he called down. "You're listening, aren't you? Tell me, if you had been lost in that blizzard, if you had felt death reaching for you with icy fingers, if something had offered you a way to survive no matter the cost, what would you have chosen?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "I'd like to think I would have chosen death over becoming what you became. But honestly, I don't know. Fear of dying makes people do terrible things. At least you're honest," the walker said, and she could hear something like approval in his voice. "Most people like to pretend they'd be heroes in such circumstances. But when death is reaching for you, when the cold is eating into your bones and your vision is going dark, survival becomes the only thing that matters." "Maybe," Sarah replied, "but what you did afterward, that wasn't about survival anymore. That was about choosing the easy path over the right path again and again for more than a century." The walker was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of surprise. "You know what the strangest part is? I remember being human. I remember caring about other people, wanting to help them, feeling guilty when I couldn't. Those feelings never went away completely. They just got buried under layers of hunger and desperation and self-justification." "They're still there," Dr. Crowfeather said gently. "Buried, but not destroyed. That's why you can still choose differently. That's why it's not too late." Sarah watched as the transformed victims moved closer to the ranger station, their faces turned upward toward the roof, where their captor wrestled with his decision. Margaret Fuller raised both hands in a gesture of supplication. "Jacob," she said, "you saved me from freezing to death when I got lost on the trail. I was grateful at first. I thought you were just a kind old man who knew the mountains. But what you did to me afterward, what you made me become, that wasn't salvation." That was damnation. I know, the walker whispered, and for the first time Sarah heard genuine remorse in his voice. I know what I did to you, to all of you. I told myself I was saving you, giving you eternal life, but I was really just spreading my own curse because I was too afraid to face it alone. The singing grew softer, more gentle, as if the tribal members sensed that their harsh confrontation was giving way to something more personal, more fragile. Dr. Crowfeather's voice carried the same gentle tone when she spoke. You don't have to face it alone, Jacob. We'll stay with you through whatever comes next, but you have to choose to let them go. You have to choose to break the cycle. Sarah heard movement on the roof, and then the walker's voice, stronger now, filled with a resolution that hadn't been there before. Margaret Fuller, he said formally. Thomas Brennan, Catherine Hayes, all of you whose names I learned and whose souls I stole, I release you. I give back what I took. I set you free from the bonds I forged and the hunger I shared. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The transformed victims began to glow with the same warm light that emanated from the earth, and their hollow ancient eyes filled with tears of relief. One by one their twisted forms straightened and became human again, the corruption falling away like old skin being shed. But as his victims found their freedom, the walker's voice began to change, becoming less human and more like the sound of wind through empty spaces. The hunger wants payment, he said, and Sarah could hear the terror creeping back into his tone. It won't let me go without compensation for what I've taken from it. Dr. Crowfeather's response was firm and immediate. Then let it take what was always meant to be its due. You, and only you. Let it collect the debt you've owed for more than a century. The building shook as something immense stirred far beneath the ground, and Sarah realized that the true confrontation was only just beginning. The ground beneath the ranger station convulsed like a living thing, and Sarah was thrown to her knees as the building swayed on its foundation. Through the windows, she could see the network of protective light flickering and pulsing, as something vast and ancient stirred in the depths below. The singing of the tribal members became more urgent, their voices rising to meet a challenge that had been sleeping beneath the mountains for millennia. Outside, the freed victims stood in wonder at their restored humanity, but their joy was short-lived. The earth split open in jagged cracks that radiated outward from some central point deeper in the forest, and from those fissures emerged a darkness so complete it seemed to devour light itself. This wasn't the mere absence of illumination. This was darkness given form and purpose, darkness that hungered. It comes, Dr. Crowfeather called out, her voice steady, despite the chaos erupting around them. The first hunger, the ancient thing that feeds on despair and sustains itself with stolen souls. Jacob's bargain was just the latest in a chain stretching back to the beginning of human presence in these mountains. The walker's voice came from everywhere at once now, no longer confined to the roof above Sarah's head. His physical form was dissolving, being drawn down into the earth to face the entity he had served for over a century. It's angry, he said, his words echoing from the growing cracks in the ground. Angrier than I've ever felt it. The souls I collected weren't just food, they were anchors, keeping it bound to the deep places. Without them, it grows stronger, but also more desperate. Sarah pressed herself against the far wall of the ranger station as one of the cracks opened directly beneath the building's foundation. Through the widening gap, she could see movement in the darkness below, something coiling and shifting that hurt to look at directly, as if her eyes couldn't quite process what they were seeing. What does it want? Sarah called out, hoping her voice would carry to Dr. Crowfeather. What it has always wanted, the doctor replied, never breaking the rhythm of her protective chant. To feed until there is nothing left to feed on. To spread its influence until every living thing becomes an extension of its will. Jacob was just its instrument. Now it seeks to act directly. The darkness rising from the cracks began to take shape, forming tentacles of pure shadow that reached toward the circle of tribal members. Where the darkness touched the earth, plants withered and died instantly, leaving behind only grey ash that scattered in the wind. But the protective circle held. The warm light emanating from the ground met the advancing darkness and neither gave way, creating a battle line where two opposing forces wrestled for dominance. The air crackled with energy, and Sarah could taste copper and ozone on her tongue. Margaret Fuller, now fully human again, turned toward the ranger station where Sarah watched from the window. "It can't cross the circle," she called out, "but it doesn't need to. It's going to try to starve us out, wait for our strength to fail." As if in response to her words, the temperature began dropping again. Not the supernatural cold that had accompanied the walker's presence, but something deeper and more fundamental, the kind of cold that existed at the heart of dead stars, in the spaces between atoms where heat had never been. The singing is what holds it back, Dr. Crow-Feather explained, her breath forming white clouds as she spoke. As long as we maintain the old songs, the protective barriers will hold. But we are only human, and it is patient in ways that mortals cannot comprehend. Sarah looked around the ranger station, searching for anything that might help. The building contained emergency supplies, communications equipment, first aid materials, all the practical tools needed for wilderness rescue work, but none of that seemed relevant when facing a primordial entity that predated human civilization. Then her eyes fell on something she'd overlooked before, a small wooden carving sitting on the bookshelf, depicting a figure with outstretched arms surrounded by animals. She'd seen it countless times during her shifts at the station, but had always assumed it was just decorative. Now, looking at it more carefully, she recognized the style as Native American craftwork. "Dr. Crow-Feather," Sarah called out. "There's a carving in here. It looks old, traditional. Could it be significant?" The doctor's voice carried a note of excitement. "Describe it. A human figure with arms outstretched, surrounded by animals, bears, eagles. What might be a salmon? The wood looks ancient." "That's a guardian totem," Dr. Crow-Feather replied. "Placed there by my grandmother's generation when the station was built. It was meant to protect anyone who sheltered there from the influence of the deep dwellers. Touch it, Sarah. Place your hands on it and add your voice to ours." Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed the carving, surprised by how warm it felt, despite the rapidly dropping temperature. The moment her skin made contact with the wood, she felt a jolt of connection, not just to the carving itself, but to everyone who had ever sought protection within these walls. "I don't know the songs," Sarah said, but even as she spoke, she realized that wasn't entirely true. The melodies were there in her mind, as if they'd been waiting dormant until this moment when they were desperately needed. She began to hum, then to sing, her voice joining the chorus outside. The words came from somewhere deeper than memory, older than her own experiences. As she sang, the carving in her hands grew warmer, and the light from outside seemed to extend into the ranger station itself. The effect on the hunger was immediate. The tentacles of darkness recoiled from the strengthened barrier, and the entity's rage manifested as a sound like the screaming of wind through a vast cavern. The cracks in the earth began to seal themselves, and the temperature started to rise. But the victory was temporary. The hunger was ancient and cunning, and it had learned patience through eons of existence. It pulled back its direct assault and began a different kind of attack, targeting the minds of those arrayed against it. Sarah felt it first as a whisper at the edge of her consciousness, a voice that sounded remarkably like her own speaking thoughts, that definitely weren't her own. "You're going to die up here," the voice said. "Even if you survive tonight, this thing will remember you. It will hunt you for the rest of your life. The only way to be safe is to join it willingly, to become its servant before it makes you its victim." Similar whispers were affecting the tribal members outside. Sarah could see some of them faltering, their voices growing weaker as doubt and fear crept into their minds. The protective circle flickered like a candle flame in a strong wind. "Don't listen to it," Dr. Crow-Feather commanded, her own voice strained with the effort of maintaining both the protective chant and her mental defenses. "It speaks lies wrapped in truth. Yes, we might die here tonight. Yes, it might remember us. But serving it willingly would be worse than death. It would be the end of everything that makes us human." The walker's voice rose from the depths, distorted now by his proximity to the hunger, but still recognizably his own. "She's right. I know because I made that choice once. I chose survival over humanity, and I've regretted it every day since. Don't make my mistake." Sarah gripped the guardian totem tighter and forced her voice to grow stronger, drowning out the whispers with her participation in the protective song. Around the circle, the other singers followed her example, their voices becoming a wall of sound that the hunger's psychological assault couldn't penetrate. But even as they held their ground, Sarah realized with growing dread that this was only the beginning. The hunger was testing their defenses, learning their strengths and weaknesses. Soon it would launch its true attack. The assault came not as Sarah expected, not as tentacles of darkness or whispered temptations, but as memory itself weaponized against the defenders. One moment she was singing in harmony with the tribal circle, the next she was 6 years old again, lost in the woods behind her childhood home in Northern California, calling for her parents as darkness fell around her small, terrified form. The memory was perfect in every detail. The smell of pine needles, the sound of her own voice growing hoarse from crying, the way the trees seemed to lean in closer as night deepened. But underneath the familiar terror was something new and alien, a presence that whispered that she would never be found, that she would die alone and afraid in the dark forest. "Fight it." Dr. Crowfeather's voice seemed to come from very far away, as if filtered through decades of time. "It's showing you fear to break your concentration. The memory is real, but the despair is its addition." Sarah forced herself to remember the rest of that childhood experience, how her father had found her within an hour, how she'd been scared but never truly in danger, how the story had become family legend rather than tragedy. She pushed back against the hunger's manipulation, and the false despair began to fade. But around the protective circle, others were struggling with their own weaponized memories. One of the younger tribal members had stopped singing entirely, his face contorted with remembered pain, as he relived what looked like a devastating personal loss. An elderly woman nearby had tears streaming down her cheeks as she battled visions that Sarah couldn't see but could feel the emotional weight of. The hunger was learning their weaknesses, diving into their personal histories to find the moments of greatest vulnerability. And with each person it managed to break, the protective circle grew weaker. Through her window, Sarah watched Margaret Fuller approach the failing sections of the barrier. The former victim moved with purpose, placing her hands on the shoulders of those being tormented by false memories. "I remember too," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos. "I remember being lost on the trail, hypothermic and disoriented. I remember the walker finding me, how grateful I was for his help. But I also remember what came after, the transformation, the hunger, the decades of being used as bait for others. Your memories of pain are real, but they're in the past. This moment, this choice to stand against the darkness, this is happening now." Her words seemed to strengthen the faltering defenders, helping them distinguish between genuine memory and the hunger's manipulations. The protective circle stabilized, its warm light pushing back against the encroaching darkness. But the hunger adapted quickly. If individual memories could be countered by human connection and perspective, then it would try something larger, deeper, more fundamental. The entity began to project not personal memories, but collective ones, the inherited trauma and ancient fears that lived in the deeper parts of human consciousness. Sarah felt it as a crushing weight of history, centuries of death and suffering and loss pressing down on her mind. She saw plague victims dying in medieval streets, soldiers falling in countless wars, children starving in famines that stretched across continents. The sheer volume of human misery throughout history threatened to overwhelm her ability to process it. "This is what you're protecting," the hunger's voice spoke directly into her mind, no longer bothering with the pretense of being her own thoughts. "This is what humanity is, generation after generation of pain and cruelty and inevitable death. Why preserve something so fundamentally broken? Why not let me end the suffering by ending the species that creates it?" But even as the dark visions threatened to crush her spirit, Sarah began to notice something the hunger either couldn't or wouldn't show her. Between the moments of tragedy were other moments, acts of kindness, sacrifices made for others, love persisting despite overwhelming odds. The same species that created so much suffering also created art and music and stories, also built communities, and healed the sick and protected the vulnerable. "You're only showing me half the picture," Sarah said aloud, her voice growing stronger. "Yes, humans cause pain, but we also create beauty. We also choose to help each other, even when it costs us everything." She thought of the tribal members outside, risking their lives to protect a stranger. She thought of Dr. Crowfeather's grandmother, who had placed protective totems in buildings she would never see, to guard people she would never meet. She thought of Margaret Fuller, using her terrible experience to help others resist the same manipulation. "That's the part you can't understand," Sarah continued, addressing the hunger directly. "You see connection as weakness, cooperation as something to exploit. But those connections are what make us strong. They're what let us stand against things like you." The guardian totem in her hands pulsed with warmth, and Sarah realized that her words were having an effect. The collective memories of human suffering were being balanced by collective memories of human resilience, courage, and compassion. The hunger's psychological assault was faltering against something it had never learned to counter: hope. Outside, the tribal singers seemed to sense the shift. Their voices grew stronger, more confident, weaving harmonies that spoke of survival and continuity across generations. The warm light from their circle expanded, pushing the darkness back toward the cracks in the earth. But the hunger wasn't finished. If memories couldn't break the defenders, perhaps the truth could. The entity began to show them visions of the future. What would happen if they failed tonight? How the darkness would spread beyond these mountains? How many innocent people would suffer because of their inability to stop it here and now? Sarah saw cities consumed by spreading corruption, saw the hunger's influence turning humans against each other on a global scale. The visions had a terrible plausibility to them, a logical progression from this moment to worldwide catastrophe. "Is your pride worth all of this?" the hunger whispered. "Your need to maintain human independence, your refusal to accept guidance from something older and wiser than your species. I could end war, end cruelty, end the chaos of free will that causes so much suffering. All I ask is that you stop fighting me." For a moment, Sarah almost considered it. The future the hunger painted was terrifying, and the entity's offer to prevent it was seductive. But then she remembered something Dr. Crowfeather had said earlier, that the hunger spoke lies wrapped in truth. "You're assuming you know what the future holds," Sarah replied. "But you don't. You can't. Because the future depends on choices that haven't been made yet, by people who haven't been born yet. You're offering to prevent a future that might never happen anyway, and the price is surrendering the very thing that makes us human, our ability to choose for ourselves." The vision of global catastrophe began to waver and fade, revealed as speculation rather than prophecy. Around the circle, the other defenders were coming to similar realizations, their voices joining together in rejection of the hunger's false promises. Dr. Crowfeather's voice rose above the others as she began a new song, one that Sarah somehow recognized despite never having heard it before. It was ancient beyond measure, a song that spoke of the first humans who had faced this entity and chosen to bind it rather than serve it. As the song continued, Sarah felt something shift in the earth beneath her feet. The hunger was being pushed back, forced to retreat into the deep places where it had slumbered for generations. But she could sense its rage, its promise that this defeat was temporary, that it would return when the Guardians grew weak or forgot their vigilance. The cracks in the earth began to seal themselves, the darkness retreating into the depths. But as the immediate threat diminished, Sarah realized that their victory had come at a cost, and that the true test of their success would be what they did with the knowledge they had gained. As the last of the darkness retreated into the sealed cracks, an eerie silence fell over the clearing around Cascade Creek Ranger Station. The protective circle's warm light began to fade, and the tribal members slowly stopped their singing, exhaustion visible on every face. Sarah remained pressed against the window, still clutching the guardian totem, afraid to believe that the immediate danger had passed. Dr. Crowfeather approached the ranger station, her movements careful and deliberate. Despite her apparent victory over the hunger, her expression was grim rather than triumphant. She knocked gently on the door, and Sarah hurried to unlock it, grateful to finally have human contact after hours of supernatural terror. "Is it over?" Sarah asked as she opened the door, though something in the doctor's eyes suggested the answer wasn't as simple as she hoped. "The immediate threat is contained," Dr. Crowfeather replied, stepping into the station. "The hunger has been forced back into dormancy, and the barriers have been re-established. But no, Sarah, it's not over. Hey, it's never really over." Through the open door, Sarah could see the freed victims of the walkers' century-long predation. They stood together in a small group, looking lost and confused despite their restored humanity. Margaret Fuller caught Sarah's eye and approached the station. "What happens to us now?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying decades of accumulated weariness. "We've been gone from the world for so long. Our families think we're dead. Our lives, our jobs, our connections, everything we were is gone." Dr. Crowfeather's expression softened with compassion. "That's part of the price the hunger exacts, even in defeat. Time lost cannot be recovered. Relationships severed cannot simply be reconnected. You're alive and human again, but you're also displaced persons in your own world." Sarah felt a stab of sympathy for the transformed victims. Their rescue had come at a cost she hadn't fully considered. They were free, but freedom meant facing the reality of lives that had moved on without them. Families who had mourned and buried empty coffins, careers that had ended with unexplained disappearances, a world that had changed in their absence. "There are ways to help," Dr. Crowfeather continued. "Our tribal social services work with people who have been displaced by various traumas. We can provide documentation, counseling, assistance in reconnecting with family members who are still alive. but it will be a long process, and some wounds may never fully heal. Thomas Brennan, who had been missing since 2003, stepped forward. What about the authorities? How do we explain where we've been for years or decades? No one's going to believe the truth. Simplified versions of the truth, the doctor replied. We'll say you were held captive by an unstable individual in a remote location, that you recently escaped or were freed. It's not entirely false, and it's something the authorities can process without having to confront supernatural realities they're not equipped to handle. Sarah noticed that one figure was notably absent from the group of survivors. What happened to Jacob Whitmore? To the walker? Dr. Crowfeather's expression grew somber. He fulfilled his bargain. When he released his victims, he broke the contract that had sustained his unnatural existence for over a century. The hunger reclaimed him completely, not as a servant this time, but as payment for what he had taken from it. Is he dead? Sarah asked. Death would be a mercy, the doctor replied. He exists now as part of the hunger itself, conscious but unable to act independently, aware of his situation but powerless to change it. In a way, it's the justice he chose for himself, eternal punishment for his crimes, but also eternal vigilance to ensure the hunger doesn't find another human agent. The weight of that revelation settled over the group. Jacob Whitmore had found redemption of a sort, but at a price that highlighted the true horror of the forces they had been dealing with. Speaking of vigilance, Dr. Crowfeather continued, turning to Sarah, we need to discuss your role in what happened tonight. You've seen things that few people outside our community have witnessed. You understand the reality of what sleeps beneath these mountains. Sarah nodded, still processing everything she had experienced. The Park Service needs to know. We need protocols for dealing with this kind of situation. Some within the Park Service already know, the doctor revealed. There have always been rangers and administrators who understood the true nature of certain wilderness areas. But the knowledge is compartmentalized, shared only with those who demonstrate both the need to know and the wisdom to handle it responsibly. She gestured toward the guardian totem still clutched in Sarah's hands. Your grandmother left that carving here for a reason. Your family has been part of this hidden network for generations, though the knowledge was deliberately kept from you until circumstances forced it into the open. Sarah stared at the wooden figure, seeing it with new understanding. My grandmother knew about the walker, about the hunger. She helped bind it the last time it stirred in 1952, Dr. Crowfeather explained. There was an incident then, not as serious as tonight, but serious enough to require intervention. Your grandmother was one of the Park Service personnel who worked with our tribal leaders to reinforce the barriers and establish new protective protocols. The revelation that her family had been secretly involved in protecting others from supernatural threats felt surreal, but also somehow inevitable. Sarah thought about her grandmother's stories of strange encounters in the wilderness, tales she had always assumed were exaggerations or folklore. What do I do with this knowledge? Sarah asked. How do I go back to normal Park Service duties knowing what's really out there? You don't go back to normal, the doctor replied. You become part of the network that stands between the ordinary world and the things that would destroy it. You learn the signs that indicate supernatural activity, you know who to contact when those signs appear, and you accept the responsibility that comes with protecting people who will never know they needed protection. Outside, dawn was beginning to break over the Cascade Mountains. The first rays of sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to banish the last traces of the night's supernatural terror, but Sarah knew that the darkness hadn't been destroyed, only contained. Margaret Fuller approached the station one more time, carrying a small object in her hands. I wanted to give you this, she said, offering Sarah a compass that looked decades old. I was carrying it when the walker found me. Somehow, I held onto it through everything that happened. It never pointed to magnetic north. It always pointed toward hope, toward the possibility of freedom. I think you'll need it more than I do now. Sarah accepted the compass, feeling its weight as both a gift and a responsibility. The needle spun wildly for a moment, before settling on a direction that definitely wasn't magnetic north. It was pointing toward the assembled tribal members, toward the people who had risked everything to save strangers. The real question, Dr. Crowfeather said as she prepared to leave the station, is whether you're ready to accept a different kind of life than the one you thought you were living. The knowledge you've gained tonight comes with obligations, Sarah. The choice is yours, but once made, it can't be undone. Sarah looked around the ranger station that had sheltered her through the longest night of her life, then at the compass in her hand, then at the people who had taught her that some battles couldn't be fought. with conventional weapons or rational strategies. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. 3 weeks after the events at Eagles Ridge, Sarah sat in the conference room at Park Service headquarters, staring at files that officially didn't exist. Around the table were faces she recognized from her normal duties, but in this context, they represented something entirely different. A shadow organization within the National Park Service dedicated to monitoring and containing supernatural threats across America's wilderness areas. Regional Director James Harrison, whom Sarah had always known as a by-the-book administrator, opened a folder marked with symbols she was only beginning to understand. "Welcome to the real job, Ranger Mitchell," he said with a wry smile. "Everything you've done up to this point has been preparation for this moment." Beside him sat Dr. Elena Vasquez, the park's chief naturalist, who had always seemed to know more about animal behavior than any textbook could explain. "The network has existed in various forms since the National Park Service was established," she explained. "We're not the first to encounter things that challenge conventional understanding of reality, and we won't be the last." Sarah opened her own copy of the files, revealing incident reports dating back decades. Unexplained disappearances, animals behaving in impossible ways, photographs that showed things that shouldn't exist, weather patterns that defied meteorological explanation. Each incident had been carefully documented, investigated by rangers who understood that some mysteries required solutions beyond standard protocols. "How many of us are there?" Sarah asked, still adjusting to the idea that her colleagues had been living double lives. "About 15% of active rangers nationwide," Harrison replied. "We recruit carefully, people who have demonstrated both competence in wilderness situations and the mental flexibility to accept realities that most people couldn't handle. Your grandmother recommended you for observation when you first joined the service." The mention of her grandmother brought back memories of childhood visits, of stories told around campfires that had seemed like folklore, but now revealed themselves as carefully disguised warnings and lessons. Sarah realized that her entire career path had been gently guided toward this moment of revelation. Dr. Vasquez pulled out a map of the western United States, marked with colored pins in various locations. Each pin represents a known supernatural hazard. Red pins are active threats requiring constant monitoring. Yellow pins are dormant entities that could become active under certain conditions. Green pins are benign phenomena that we simply document and study. Sarah studied the map, noting clusters of pins in areas she knew well. "There are a lot more than I expected. America's wilderness areas have always been refuges for things that don't fit into the modern world," Dr. Vasquez explained. "Some are ancient entities that predated human settlement. Others are more recent phenomena, places where trauma or tragedy has left psychic residue that manifests in supernatural ways. Our job is to maintain the balance between protecting these areas and protecting the people who visit them." Harrison slid another folder across the table. "Your specific assignment will be the Cascade Mountain region. You'll continue your normal ranger duties, but you'll also be responsible for monitoring the sites where the hunger was active. Dr. Crow Feather's Tribal Council has agreed to work with us, sharing traditional knowledge in exchange for our support in protecting sacred sites." Sarah opened the new folder to find detailed reports on every supernatural incident in the Cascades over the past 50 years. The walkers' activities were just one thread in a much larger tapestry of unexplained phenomena. There were accounts of hikers encountering people who couldn't be photographed, animals that spoke human languages, weather systems that responded to emotional states rather than atmospheric pressure. "What about the survivors from Eagles Ridge?" Sarah asked. "Margaret Fuller and the others." "They're being integrated into a separate program," Dr. Vasquez replied. "People who have survived supernatural encounters often develop heightened sensitivity to similar phenomena. With proper training, they can become valuable assets in identifying and responding to new threats." She pulled out another file, this one containing photographs that made Sarah's stomach clench. "Margaret has already helped us identify 3 other locations where entities similar to the hunger may be active. Her experience, terrible as it was, gave her insights that could prevent others from suffering the same fate." The photographs showed missing person cases from national parks across the country: Yellowstone, Yosemite, the Great Smoky Mountains. In each case, the circumstances were eerily similar to the Eagles Ridge disappearances: solo hikers vanishing without a trace, leaving behind only scattered belongings and unanswered questions. "Are we fighting a losing battle?" Sarah asked, overwhelmed by the scope of what she was learning. How can we possibly monitor and contain all of this? Harrison's expression grew serious. We're not trying to eliminate the supernatural, Sarah. That would be impossible and arguably undesirable. These entities and phenomena are part of the natural world, just aspects of it that mainstream science hasn't yet learned to acknowledge or understand. Our goal is balance, allowing these forces to exist while preventing them from causing large-scale harm to human populations. Dr. Vasquez nodded in agreement. Think of us as environmental protection specialists, but for a more complex ecosystem than most people realize exists. We're not exterminators. We're conservationists who understand that nature includes forces that can't be measured with conventional instruments. Sarah thought about the hunger, now contained but not destroyed, sleeping in the deep places beneath Eagle's Ridge. What's to stop the hunger from finding another human agent? Another Jacob Whitmore? Constant vigilance, Harrison replied. Enhanced monitoring protocols. Regular communication with tribal authorities who understand these entities better than we do, and most importantly, education. The more people who understand the true nature of these threats, the less likely they are to fall victim to them. He gestured toward a wall map showing the entire Pacific Northwest. Your new responsibilities will include training other rangers in supernatural recognition and response protocols. Knowledge is our best defense against entities that prey on human ignorance and isolation. Dr. Vasquez added another folder to Sarah's growing collection. You'll also be working with researchers from universities that have quietly been studying these phenomena for decades. There's an entire academic discipline that exists in the shadows, documenting and analyzing supernatural events with the same rigor applied to any other scientific field. The folder contained contact information for professors of anthropology, psychology, physics, and biology who specialized in anomalous phenomena. Sarah realized that the network extended far beyond the Park Service, encompassing scholars, tribal leaders, government officials, and civilian researchers who had chosen to dedicate their lives to understanding and protecting against supernatural threats. One more thing, Harrison said, his tone becoming more personal. This work comes with significant personal costs. You'll be privy to information that you can never share with family or friends outside the network. You'll witness things that will change your fundamental understanding of reality. You'll carry the burden of protecting people who will never know they needed protection. He paused, studying Sarah's face. If you want to decline this assignment, there are ways to modify your memories of recent events. You could return to normal ranger duties with no recollection of what you've learned. It's not a decision we would judge harshly. Sarah thought about the compass Margaret Fuller had given her, which now sat on her desk at home, its needle consistently pointing towards sources of hope and human connection rather than magnetic north. She thought about her grandmother's stories, which she now understood as carefully disguised warnings and wisdom. She thought about the people who had risked their lives to save her and the victims of the walkers' predation. "I'm in," she said firmly. "Whatever this job requires, I'm ready for it." Harrison smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern features. "Welcome to the real National Park Service, Ranger Mitchell. Your grandmother would be proud." As the meeting concluded and Sarah gathered her new files, she realized that her life had irrevocably changed. She was no longer just a park ranger. She was a guardian standing between the ordinary world and forces that most people couldn't imagine. The responsibility was daunting, but for the first time since the events at Eagle's Ridge, she felt like she understood her true purpose. 6 months later, Sarah stood once again at the Eagle's Ridge trailhead, but this time she wasn't alone. Beside her, Margaret Fuller checked the specialized equipment they now carried on their monthly monitoring expeditions: electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and instruments designed by the network's researchers to measure supernatural activity levels. "Any readings today?" Sarah asked, though she could already sense the answer. After months of working together, both women had developed an intuitive awareness of the area's spiritual temperature. "Lower than normal," Margaret replied, adjusting the settings on her detection equipment. "The barriers are holding strong." Dr. Crowfeather's renewal ceremonies last month seemed to have reinforced the containment significantly. They began their ascent along the familiar trail, but now Sarah saw it with educated eyes. Every landmark had meaning. The twisted pine tree marked a spot where the barrier between dimensions grew thin during certain weather conditions. The cluster of boulders at the second switchback contained carved symbols that most hikers assumed were natural rock formations, but were actually protective wards placed by indigenous peoples centuries ago. As they climbed higher, Sarah reflected on how much her understanding of the wilderness had changed. What she had once seen as pristine, natural areas were actually complex ecosystems that included supernatural elements as natural components. The network's files contained reports of beneficial entities as well as dangerous ones, spirits that guided lost hikers to safety, forest guardians that protected endangered species from human interference, ancient consciousnesses that maintained the delicate balance between the physical and metaphysical worlds. "Contact from base," Margaret said, touching the communication device integrated into her equipment harness. Unlike standard park service radios, these devices used quantum entanglement technology developed by network researchers to maintain contact even in areas where conventional communications failed. Sarah activated her own receiver and heard Dr. Vasquez's voice clearly, despite their elevation and the surrounding mountains. "Monitoring team, we're tracking unusual seismic activity about 15 miles northeast of your position. Could be natural, but the pattern matches signatures we've seen associated with deep entity movement." "Acknowledged," Sarah replied. "We'll complete our current survey and then investigate the seismic anomaly, ETA approximately 2 hours." The routine had become familiar over the past months. Supernatural phenomena, often presented as natural events to conventional monitoring equipment, but the network had learned to identify the subtle differences that indicated otherworldly activity. Earthquakes that followed mathematical patterns too precise for geological processes, weather systems that formed against prevailing winds, animal migrations that defied seasonal patterns, all potential signs that something beyond normal nature was influencing the environment. They reached the ridge proper, as afternoon shadows began lengthening through the forest. The rocky outcropping where Sarah had first encountered the walker looked peaceful in the golden sunlight, but both women could feel the weight of what lay beneath, not just the dormant hunger, but the accumulated psychic residue of more than a century of predation and suffering. Margaret knelt beside a specific boulder and placed her hand against its surface. "He's still down there," she said quietly. "Jacob, sometimes I can sense his presence trapped within the thing he served. I think he's trying to warn us when the containment shows signs of weakening." Sarah had learned to trust Margaret's enhanced perceptions. Her ordeal with the walker had left her sensitive to supernatural influences in ways that proved invaluable for monitoring work. Similar abilities had developed in the other survivors, making them crucial assets for the network's operations across the country. "Any concerns about the current containment level?" Sarah asked. Margaret shook her head. "Strong and stable. The tribal ceremonies are definitely working. Dr. Crowfeather's people have been performing renewal rituals every new moon, reinforcing the barriers and ensuring the hunger stays dormant." They completed their instrument readings and began the descent toward the seismic anomaly location. As they hiked, Sarah's radio crackled with updates from other monitoring teams across the region. 2 teams in the Olympic Mountains reported unusual mist formations that might indicate portal activity. A solo ranger in the North Cascades had photographed animal tracks that didn't match any known species. Normal day-to-day operations for the network. The seismic activity site turned out to be a natural cave system that had partially collapsed during recent heavy rains. Sarah's instruments detected no supernatural signatures, just ordinary geological processes, accelerated by unusual precipitation patterns. But they documented everything anyway. The network had learned that seemingly mundane events sometimes preceded more significant supernatural manifestations. As evening approached and they prepared to return to base, Sarah received a message that made her pause. Thomas Brennan, another Eagles Ridge survivor, was reporting successful contact with an entity in Glacier National Park that appeared to be protecting endangered grizzly bears from poachers. If confirmed, it would be their first documented case of active supernatural environmental protection. "The job keeps getting more interesting," Margaret observed, reading the same message on her device. Sarah smiled, thinking about how dramatically her understanding of ranger work had evolved. Instead of simply protecting visitors from natural hazards, she was now part of a complex network that managed relationships between human society and forces that most people didn't know existed. It was more challenging, more dangerous, and more meaningful than anything she had imagined when she first put on a ranger uniform. They reached the parking area as the last light faded from the western sky. In the distance, Eagles Ridge rose against the stars, its slopes concealing secrets that would remain hidden from the general public but never again from those charged with protecting both the mountain and the people who visited it. "Same time next month?" Margaret asked as they loaded their equipment into Sarah's truck. "Same time next month," Sarah confirmed. "And every month after that, for as long as it takes." Because that was the nature of the work they had chosen. Eternal vigilance against forces that never truly slept, never permanently retreated, never stopped testing the barriers that kept them contained. It was a responsibility that would be passed from one generation of guardians to the next, a duty that connected them to rangers and tribal protectors who had walked these same trails for centuries. As Sarah drove back toward headquarters, she glanced in her rearview mirror at Eagle's Ridge, disappearing into the darkness behind them. Somewhere beneath those mountains, the hunger waited in forced slumber, contained but not destroyed, patient in ways that human minds could barely comprehend, and somewhere in the deep places where it dwelt, the consciousness that had once been Jacob Whitmore maintained its eternal watch, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would never again trap innocent souls in an unending nightmare. The compass Margaret had given her sat on the dashboard, its needle pointing steadily toward the lights of the town ahead, toward home, toward the people she protected, toward hope that would outlast any darkness. It was a reminder that no matter how strange or terrifying the supernatural world became, the fundamental human values of courage, compassion, and connection would always provide a path through the chaos. Sarah Mitchell, park ranger and guardian, drove through the night toward whatever challenges tomorrow would bring, knowing that she was part of something larger than herself, a network of protectors standing watch over the boundary between the known and unknown, ensuring that America's wilderness remained a place of wonder rather than terror for the millions who sought refuge in its natural beauty. The work would continue, as it always had, as it always would. And in the end, that continuity itself was the greatest victory against forces that sought to disrupt the delicate balance between worlds.